World War II, a life-changing event known to all for the battles that mark our history. Maybe you've heard of the world leaders who've raised their voices in participation to the war, or maybe you've only heard of it by word of mouth. But have you ever learned of the Navajo code talkers who fought against discrimination and assimilation to bring America the victory we know of today?
Beginning in the early 19th century, with the rise of westward expansion, many American citizens moved to the West in hopes of finding riches, a new life, and a new start. Westward expansion was mainly caused by the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad that connected the country in 1869, and the passage of the Homestead Act in 1862, which encouraged citizens to move into 160 acres of unsettled land in the West.
This caused conflicts between tribal nations and the newly settled citizens. Therefore, many Native Americans were forced out of their land and into reservations through the Treaty of Fort Laramie, an agreement between the United States and Native Americans to establish peace.
The aforesaid nations do hereby covenant and agree to abstain in future from all hostilities whatever against each other, and to make an effective and lasting peace.
The treaty also opened the doors to the assimilation of Native Americans, forcing them to learn and adapt to a different language and culture.
63 years later, at the start of World War I, native Choctaw Indians volunteered to fight for our nation. At the time, when the enemies tapped into the American Army's communication system, they were able to uncover U.S. Army tactics, future attacks, the location of supplies, and more. As a result, Colonel A.W. Bloor of the 142nd Infantry Regiment chose 2 Choctaw officers and 18 others to create a code using the native language. Unfortunately, most U.S. military terms did not have a direct translation into Choctaw, which resulted in the creation of a series of improvised words that connected to the English term.
As said by Colonel Bloor in a report to his commanding general, it had been found that the Indians' vocabulary of military terms was insufficient. The Indian word for big gun was used to indicate artillery, little gun shoot fast was substituted for machine gun, and the battalions were indicated by 1, 2, and 3 grains of corn. Fortunately for the U.S. troops, the enemy forces were never able to decode the transmission, and throughout the war continued to recruit Native Americans as code talkers, such as the Cheyenne, Comanche, Cherokee, Osage, and Yankton Sioux.
Moving forward into the future, on December 7, 1941, the Japanese Army bombed Pearl Harbor. In the wake of the attack, America was officially thrown into war against Japan, a country whose military consisted of expert codebreakers. The U.S. Army needed an efficient and unbreakable method of communication, but what could it be?
Luckily, Philip Johnston, a civil engineer living in Los Angeles and the son of 2 Navajo missionaries, heard of the U.S. Army's need of communication. He, coupled with a few other Navajo friends, traveled to San Diego to propose the idea of using the Navajo language as a code because of its complexity and the lack of an alphabet to a communications commander in the U.S. Marines.
The Marines obliged, and they went into the Navajo reservation, which included parts of New Mexico, Utah, Arizona, and Colorado, to visit schools and set up a recruitment station where over 600 Navajo Indians enlisted. The Marine Corps wished to have 200 Navajo trainees, however they were only allowed to use 30 Navajos for the initial training. 29 of the 30 chosen Navajos traveled to boot camp in San Diego, where they passed their physical test due to good health and made up the 382nd Platoon. After completing their training, they were sent to Fort Elliott, California, and within a steel-barred building, they were provided with a list of military terms, such as names of weapons, units, and countries, to translate into Navajo code.
For each letter of the English alphabet, there would be an English word beginning with that letter but translated into Navajo. Imagine the word ant for the letter A, and bear for the letter B. Those words would then be translated into the Navajo language. They would use the Navajo word for ant to represent A, and the Navajo word for bear to represent B. Meanwhile, frequently used letters were given 3 code words. For example, apple, ant, and axe were translated into the Navajo language to represent A. This way, the same words weren't repeated when transmitting messages. Fortunately enough, there was a trick to learning the code. Objects that flew were named after birds. Objects that were on the ground were named after things that you would find on land, and objects that floated or were submerged underwater were named after fish.
The Navajo language was chosen as a basis for coded messages because it lacked a written alphabet and consisted of different pronunciations and intonations, which make the language difficult to understand. Even Navajos themselves were unable to decipher the code. After successfully creating the code, the Marine Corps began recruiting more code talkers. Only 421 Navajos who trained at the Navajo Code Talker School in Camp Pendleton were able to qualify as code talkers. The learning process was difficult, and many had to retake and relearn the Navajo code in order to pass. Moreover, it was a top-secret code that was not allowed to be shared with anyone outside of the camp. Carl Gorman, one of the original 29 code talkers, said, "For us, everything is a memory. It's part of our heritage. We have no written language. Our songs, our prayers, our stories, they're all handed down from grandfather to father to children. And we listen, we hear, we learn to remember everything. It's part of our training."
The Battle of Iwo Jima was the bloody battle. The code talkers worked non-stop, transmitting more than 800 messages in 48 hours. They were given English messages that the talkers translated into code almost immediately. They would then send the translated message to another code talker who wrote down the transmission in English and entered it into a message logbook. This would take 2.5 minutes, a process that, without the code talkers, spanned 2 whole hours to finish.
Many Marine officials and code talkers themselves have said that the Battle of Iwo Jima was proof of how important the code talkers were to America's success in World War II. Major Howard Connor, the 5th Marine Division signal officer, stated that were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima. The destruction was over, the enemy had lost, but what of the future that lay ahead?
With every triumph leads a tragedy, and with every tragedy leads a triumph.
There's no better way to put it, just racism. There's this assumption that Native Americans were savages. There's one of our documents here is a code talker dictionary that they used to hand out to Marine officers to teach them about what the code talkers are doing, and the cover of it has a cartoon of 2 Native Americans wearing loincloths and going ugh, and it has a canteen that says fire water, and it's just like really offensive stuff, and I always kind of blows my mind because here these guys are using their culture to do a very important thing, and they're basically making fun of them.
Because of the code talkers, the United States won the war in the Pacific. Their ability to decipher and send messages without any mistakes in order to execute orders effectively greatly helped the Marine Corps in the battlefield. Unfortunately, the Navajos' work was to remain top secret from everyone, including their friends and relatives, until 1968, when their mission was declassified. Approximately 23 years passed without any recognition of how the Navajo code talkers sacrificed their lives for America and its prosperity. The Navajo code talkers received the well-deserved Congressional Gold Medal for their service. The medal was presented by President George W. Bush in 2001.
As Chester Nez, a former Navajo code talker, had said, "My wartime experiences developing the code that utilized the Navajo language taught how important our Navajo culture is to our country. For us, that is the central lesson, that diverse cultures can make a country richer and stronger." With the code talkers' help, America was able to intervene with the Japanese and their goal to conquer Asian land. These countries, who were once held under the grasp of the Japanese army, would not be the free nations they are today if it weren't for the code talkers.
There wasn't much knowledge about them as a people or knowledge within the Navajo community about the outside world, and code talkers are able to be ambassadors for their culture and their language and their people.
The Navajo code talkers, who were forced onto reservations, stripped from their culture, language, and freedom, served proudly as one with the country that once assimilated them. But in the end, our nation greeted them as one of our own, and the language that was once forbidden became the weapon that saved the lives of many around the world and granted America with a monumental victory.